Winter 1944, the Apennine Mountains, Italy. For Lieutenant Miller and the freezing remnants of Able Company, this god-forsaken valley had become their tomb. For 6 agonizing hours, the relentless chatter of a single German MG-42 Hitler's buzzsaw had echoed off the granite cliffs, pinning them to the frozen mud. The gun was untouchable, dug into a concrete bunker tucked deep behind a jagged rock outcropping, a ghost, a phantom that dealt death with impunity from a position artillery couldn't reach and men couldn't see. Every desperate rush, every attempt to flank, had ended in the crimson stain of American blood on white snow. Hope was a frozen corpse. Miller, his radio handset trembling from cold and exhaustion, did the only thing left to do. He called for artillery, a fool's errand. He gave the coordinates for the mountain ridge, knowing full well that no conventional shell could possibly arc over the peak and strike a target hidden on its reverse slope. It was a prayer whispered into a storm. Then a lone whistle sliced through the air. Not the familiar scream of a barrage, but a single, eerie note. His men watched it, a dark speck against a grey sky, flying impossibly high. It was going to miss. Of course it was going to miss. But then it happened. The shell seemed to hesitate at its apex, as if guided by an unseen hand. It broke its own sacred laws of physics, and plunged straight down. A muffled thump followed by a cloud of black smoke and concrete dust billowing from behind the ridge. And then, silence. The buzzsaw was dead. The men of Able Company looked at each other in stunned disbelief, convinced they had witnessed a divine miracle. They were wrong. This was not an act of God. It was the birth of a weapon that would teach steel how to think, and it would forever change the brutal arithmetic of war. The extraordinary moment in the Apennines was not a random stroke of luck. It was the answer to a deadly equation that had stumped the greatest military minds of the generation, a problem written in blood and steel across every battlefield, from the Pacific to the heart of Europe, the tyranny of terrain. For centuries, the fundamental rule of artillery, the undisputed king of battle, had been brutally simple. What the gun could not see, it could not kill. A shell is a slave to gravity and momentum, a mindless projectile tracing a graceful, predictable, and utterly inflexible arc through the sky. This arc, the very source of artillery's power to strike from miles away, was also its most profound weakness. It meant that a commander with a map, a protractor, and a grasp of basic physics could create fortresses that were for all intents and purposes invincible to conventional bombardment. This invincibility was born from a simple geographic principle, the reverse slope. An enemy who dug his defenses onto the side of a hill or mountain facing away from his attacker had created a sanctuary. American artillery could unleash hell upon the forward slope, pulverizing rock into dust and turning forests into splinters. But the shells would scream harmlessly overhead, impacting hundreds of yards beyond the hidden enemy. The mountain itself became the shield, its stony mass absorbing the fury of 1,000 guns. The men hunkered down in those reverse slope bunkers, in those camouflaged ravines and sunken roads, were untouchable. From these lairs they could wait out the most ferocious barrages in relative safety, emerging the moment the shelling stopped to pour murderous machine gun and mortar fire down upon the advancing infantry, who had been promised a clear path. The Allied response to this problem was one of brute, unimaginative force saturation. If you couldn't hit a specific target, you simply tried to annihilate the entire grid square. This was a strategy of industrial attrition, a horrifying calculus that pitted American manufacturing against German lives. Divisions of artillery would fire for hours, sometimes days on end, attempting to turn acres of geography into a lifeless lunar landscape in the desperate hope that a few lucky rounds might find their mark. The cost was astronomical. It consumed mountains of ammunition, strained supply lines to their breaking point, and broadcasted the location of the Allied guns to enemy counter-battery fire. More critically, it often failed. An entire battalion of 155mm howitzers could churn the earth for an afternoon, only for a single well-protected machine gun nest to emerge from the smoke and rubble, ready to scythe down the next wave of American GIs. Nowhere was this horrifying impotence more starkly illustrated than in the grinding, bloody struggle for the Gustav Line. Stretching across the mountainous spine of Italy, the Gustav Line was not merely a series of trenches. It was a masterpiece of defensive engineering, a fortress built by God and perfected by the devil. German engineers, masters of their craft, had woven their positions into the very fabric of the landscape. Bunkers were blasted out of solid rock, observation posts were hidden in ancient ruins, and artillery positions were nestled on reverse slopes that commanded every possible approach. The linchpin of this entire line was the mountain of Monte Cassino, a place that would become synonymous with American suffering. For months in late 1943 and early 1000, 944 American forces threw themselves against this wall. The story was always the same. The advance would begin with a deafening artillery barrage, a thunderous overture that seemed capable of cracking the world in two. The infantry, believing their path cleared, would move forward into the shattered valleys, and then, as they began their ascent, the hidden guns would open up. From positions that Allied artillery couldn't touch, German machine guns and mortars would unleash a perfectly sighted crossfire. The advance would falter, and then break, leaving the slopes littered with the dead and dying. The frustration among the artillery crews was palpable. They were the most powerful arm of the service, capable of leveling cities, yet they were helpless against the specific guns that were slaughtering their comrades. They would receive desperate calls for fire support from infantry units pinned down just a few hundred yards away, but they could do nothing. They could drop shells all around the estimated enemy position, but they could not hit the source. Every round fired was an admission of failure. The gunners would work themselves to exhaustion, their arms aching, their ears ringing, knowing that for all the noise and fury they unleashed, the one bunker that mattered remained unscathed, patiently waiting to continue its grim harvest. This single tactical problem had strategic consequences that rippled all the way back to the high command. The Italian campaign stalled, bogged down in a brutal static war of attrition that resembled the worst horrors of the First World War. Timetables slipped, casualties mounted to unsustainable levels. Morale, the fragile currency of any army, began to plummet. For the infantryman on the ground, the feeling was one of utter betrayal. He was being asked to attack an enemy that his army's most powerful weapons could not suppress. It felt less like a battle and more like a state-sanctioned suicide mission. He was being thrown into a meat grinder while the king of battle watched impotent. The Allied war machine, the greatest the world had ever seen, was being held at bay, not by a superior force, but by the simple, immutable laws of geometry. Something had to change. They didn't need a bigger shell or a longer-range gun. They needed to break the rules. They needed a bullet that could see around corners. They needed a miracle forged from steel and wire. While soldiers died in the frozen mud of the Apennines, the solution to their slaughter was not being devised in a general's tent or on a factory floor. It was born in a place far from the thunder of the front lines, a soundproofed, lead-lined laboratory at the California Institute of Technology, under a veil of secrecy so thick that even the university's president knew only a vague cover story about improving radio communications. This was the home of Project Echo, a collection of the nation's most brilliant and most eccentric minds, physicists, who saw the world as a symphony of vibrations, acoustical engineers who could map a room with their eyes closed, and maverick electronics specialists who believed the laws of physics were merely suggestions. They were not soldiers, but they had been handed the soldiers' most intractable problem. Their leader was Dr. Alistair Finch, a gaunt, perpetually exhausted man who lived on black coffee and nicotine, and who heard the desperate radio calls from Italy, not as military reports, but as a personal scientific challenge. The problem, as he saw it, was not one of firepower, but of information. The shell was blind. Finch's audacious, almost insane proposal was to give it ears. The concept was elegant in its simplicity, bordering on science fiction. It involved a two-part system. First, a forward observer, a scout or a frontline infantryman, would carry a small handheld device called the beacon. This device would be aimed at the target, the hidden bunker, the camouflaged gun emplacement, and would emit a silent, high-frequency ultrasonic pulse, a sound utterly inaudible to the human ear. This pulse would be coded a unique acoustic signature like a key. The second part was the Hunter, a standard 105mm or 155mm artillery shell, but with its nose cone replaced by a marvel of miniaturization. Inside was a sensitive crystal receiver. the shell's ear tuned to listen for one thing and one thing only, the specific echo of the beacon's acoustic key. As the shell traveled along its conventional arc and began to descend into the target area, its ear would switch on. It would listen, ignoring the cacophony of the battlefield for the faint coded echo bouncing off the target. Once it heard it, a tiny electronic brain, no larger than a man's fist, would calculate the sound's direction and activate 4 small pop-out fins near the shell's nose. These fins would make minute adjustments, steering the shell in the last crucial seconds of its flight, guiding it with unerring precision onto the source of the echo. It was, in essence, a way to make a bullet hear its target. The theory was beautiful. The reality was a nightmare. The team immediately slammed into a series of technological walls that seemed not just challenging but fundamentally impossible to overcome with 1,940 seconds technology. The first and most brutal was the sheer cataclysmic violence of an artillery launch. When a shell is fired, it is subjected to forces of acceleration that defy comprehension. Not 100 Gs, not 1,000, but over 1,5,000 times the force of gravity. For the fraction of a second it travelled down the cannon barrel, an object the size of a sugar cube would momentarily weigh as much as a small car. Finch's prototypes containing delicate vacuum tubes and precisely ground crystal receivers were utterly annihilated. Test after test ended the same way the shell would be fired, and what was recovered was not a sophisticated guidance system, but a useless lump of shattered glass, mangled wires, and pulverized crystal dust. For months, Project Echo was producing nothing but the world's most expensive scrap metal. Even if they could solve the G-force problem, a second more insidious challenge awaited them: the chaos of the battlefield. The shell's ear needed to be sensitive enough to detect a faint, high-frequency echo from hundreds of yards away. But the environment it had to listen in was the loudest, most violent place on Earth. It was a hurricane of sound, the deafening roar of friendly artillery, the concussive blast of other exploding shells, the rattle of machine guns, the scream of diving aircraft, the rumble of tank treads. How could a receiver possibly distinguish the whisper-thin signal it was looking for from that overwhelming wall of noise? It was a paradox that nearly broke the project. They were trying to build a microphone that could hear a pin drop in the middle of a volcanic eruption. Early tests were a disaster. The shells would either hear nothing or, worse, would hear everything and dive randomly toward the loudest noise they detected, often a friendly tank or another exploding shell. Finally, there was the problem of control. Steering a spinning supersonic object with any degree of precision was uncharted territory. The pop-out fins had to be incredibly strong to withstand the aerodynamic forces, yet light enough to be deployed by a tiny internal mechanism. The electronic brain had to perform thousands of calculations a second, translating the incoming sound data into precise fin movements. Their first successful fin deployment systems caused the shells to become unstable, to wobble and tumble uselessly out of the sky. The project was bleeding money and time, and the reports from Italy grew more desperate with each passing week. The army was losing patience with Finch's impossible toy. The breakthrough came not in one single flash of insight, but in 2 separate grueling moments of discovery. To solve the G-force problem, they abandoned the attempt to make the components stronger. Instead, they decided to cushion them. An engineer, recalling how insects were preserved in amber, proposed suspending the entire electronic assembly, the tubes, the crystal, the circuits in a thick, resin-like gel. During the violent launch, this gel would momentarily compress into a rock-solid mass, encasing the delicate components in a protective cradle, distributing the immense forces evenly. When the acceleration ceased, the gel would return to its pliable state, allowing the system to function. They stopped trying to build an unbreakable wall and instead built a shock absorber. It worked. The components survived the launch. The second, more profound breakthrough came from Finch himself during a sleepless night surrounded by diagrams of sound waves. The key wasn't to make the ear more sensitive, but to make it more selective. The beacon wouldn't just send out a simple ping. It would transmit a complex chord of multiple ultrasonic frequencies in a specific timed sequence, a short, silent melody. The shell's electronic brain would be programmed with a filter that ignored every sound in the universe except the precise echo of that exact acoustic melody. It wouldn't just be listening for a sound, it would be listening for a song. All the random noise of the battlefield would be just static. Only the echo of the target singing the right tune would get through. The first time they tested it in the lab, blasting recordings of artillery fire at the prototype, the receiver's oscilloscope remained dead. Then they played the coded signal. The needle leaped to life, pure and clean. He had found it. The acoustic key to unlock any target on the battlefield. The miracle was no longer a theory. Now it had to be weaponized. The laboratory success of Project Echo was a sterile academic victory. The real test would not be measured on an oscilloscope, but in the cessation of German machine gun fire on a blood-soaked Italian hillside. In the spring of 1944, a handful of unmarked wooden crates and a small, tight-lipped team of Finch's best technicians were flown under the highest priority to the Fifth Army headquarters in Italy. They were a ghost unit, their cargo logged as specialized meteorological equipment. Their true destination was the one place on Earth that had become the graveyard of Allied hope and the symbol of artillery's failure, Monte Cassino, and the unbreachable Gustav Line. When the team arrived, the front was a landscape of hellish grinding stasis. The same German positions that had decimated American divisions in January were still there in March, as seemingly eternal as the mountains they were carved into. The American gun lines stretched for miles, a vast arsenal of firepower that had proven utterly useless against the targets that mattered most. The GIs in their foxholes looked up at the German-held ridges with a mixture of hatred and fatalistic dread. The artillery officers, weary of failure, were deeply skeptical of the quiet scientists and their mysterious crates. To them, this was another crackpot idea from the boffins back home, a distraction from the grim business of a war they were not winning. The first target chosen was a case study in German defensive genius, designated Strongpoint 4 Alpha. It was a battery of 81mm mortars dug into a reverse slope of a secondary ridge below the main peak of Monte Cassino. It was invisible from the air and completely shielded from direct fire. For 7 weeks, these mortars had rained down a steady, methodical barrage on the American approach routes, a torment known to the infantry simply as the daily hate. An entire artillery battalion, 12 155mm howitzers, had been tasked with silencing it. They had fired over 4,000 rounds at the suspected location, turning the forward slope of the ridge into a pockmarked wasteland, all without ever once stopping the mortar fire. 4 Alpha was invincible. On a moonless night, 2 men from the OSS, carrying a standard field radio and the strange tripod-mounted beacon, began a 7-hour crawl through no man's land. They were the key. Their mission was not to fight, but to see and to aim. After navigating minefields and German patrols, they found a position in a shattered farmhouse, a mere 600 yards from the ridge, hiding 4 Alpha. Through their binoculars, they could just make out the faint flicker of activity as the German crews prepared for their morning's work. They set up the beacon, aimed it at the crest of the hill, and keyed their radio. "Echo 1 is hot," the scout whispered, singing to the target. Miles away in a camouflaged gun pit, a single howitzer was loaded with a T-13 Hunter round. The gun crew, under the stern watch of one of Finch's technicians, went through their calculations. They weren't aiming for the mortars. They were aiming for a patch of empty sky just above and beyond them, an acquisition basket where the shell's ear would activate. The order was given. A single sharp crack echoed through the valley and the shell was on its way. For the GIs in the line, it was just another random shot, one of thousands. But for the OSS scouts, it was the culmination of everything. They watched the sky waiting. For nearly a minute, there was nothing. Then they saw it, a tiny speck beginning its final terminal descent. It wasn't wobbling, it wasn't tumbling. It was flying with an unnatural purpose. As it plunged into the basket, a series of barely audible clicks emanated from the shell as its acoustic brain awoke and its fins deployed. It began to turn, correcting its path, homing in on the silent song echoing from the rocks below. It no longer flew like a shell. It flew like a hawk diving on its prey. The impact was not a massive, earth-shattering explosion. It was a sharp, vicious crack precisely on the reverse side of the ridge crest. A geyser of rock metal and black smoke erupted from a spot no American had ever seen before. The daily hate did not begin that morning. It never would again. Strongpoint 4 Alpha had ceased to exist. Word of the miracle shot spread like wildfire. The skeptical artillery commanders demanded a repeat performance. The next night, the OSS team painted another target, a notorious machine gun bunker that had pinned down an entire company. Again, a single gun fired a single shell. Again, the target was obliterated. The floodgates opened. What began as an experiment became the new doctrine. Instead of saturation, the Fifth Army began to practice assassination. The numbers were staggering in their efficiency. Where a full battalion firing for a week had failed, a single gun crew with a handful of hunter rounds now succeeded in a single night. One by one, the invincible strong points of the Gustav Line were being systematically dismantled. An observation post here, a command bunker there. The American artillery, once a blunt instrument of brute force, had become a surgeon's scalpel. On the German side, confusion curdled into terror. Their most secure positions, places where they could laugh at the heaviest barrages, were being vaporized by what seemed to be phantom strikes. There was no warning, no screaming descent of hundreds of shells, just a single, inexplicable explosion of devastating accuracy. The psychological impact was catastrophic. A German officer's letter recovered later captured the panic. "We are being hunted by ghosts. Positions that have withstood everything are simply disappearing. There is no pattern, no warning. Men are going mad, convinced the Americans have a death ray or that God has turned against us. No place is safe. The mountains no longer protect us. They have become our tombs." German intelligence was thrown into chaos. Their analysts reviewed after-action reports and were baffled. They theorized about new high-altitude bombers with incredible accuracy, about radio-controlled rockets, about infiltration teams, planting demolition charges. The one thing they could not conceive, the one possibility that seemed too technologically fantastic to be real, was that the shells themselves were intelligent. They were searching for a complex system, a grand weapon. They never suspected that the revolution was contained in the nose cone of a simple artillery round. Their entire defensive strategy, built on the predictable physics of ballistics, had been rendered obsolete overnight. For the American infantry, the change was nothing short of salvation. The paths that had been death traps were now quiet. The guns that had tormented them were silent. They could move, advance, and fight. The unbreakable Gustav Line, the fortress that had consumed tens of thousands of lives, had not been smashed by a tidal wave of force. It had been unlocked, key by key, by an invisible melody and a shell that could hear it. The king of battle had finally learned how to whisper, and its whisper was death. The stunning success of Project Echo on the Gustav Line was a paradigm shift, a revolution that rippled through the highest echelons of Allied command. The problem of the reverse slope, the tactical cancer that had plagued the army for years, had been cured. But as the Allied armies broke out of the Normandy beachheads and began the bloody fight across France, they left the mountains of Italy behind, only to face a new kind of hell, a battlefield even more complex and unforgiving the city. Urban warfare was a three-dimensional nightmare, a chaotic labyrinth of stone and steel, where every window could hide a sniper, every alleyway could berth an ambush, and every rooftop could house a machine gun. Here, the old rules of artillery were not just ineffective, they were catastrophic. A single German strongpoint, a Panther tank hidden in a courtyard, an MG-42 nest in a third-story apartment, could hold up an entire battalion. The conventional answer was to call in the 155mm guns and systematically reduce the city block to rubble. But this was a butcher's solution. It was slow, it consumed immense amounts of ammunition, and it came at a horrific cost. It killed untold numbers of French civilians who were huddled in their cellars. It destroyed priceless cultural heritage, and it often created more problems than it solved, turning streets into impassable mountains of debris that were even easier for the defenders to hold. More importantly, it was a profound moral failure for an army that claimed to be one of liberation. For Project Echo, the city presented a challenge that threatened to make the entire system obsolete. The elegant science of its acoustic guidance was designed for the relatively clean soundscape of the mountains where a single echo could be easily isolated. A city, however, was an acoustic funhouse. It was a cacophony of echoes, a maze of reflecting surfaces where the beacon's signal would bounce off dozens of buildings, creating a confusing storm of false targets. The shell's simple brain, programmed to home in on the first clear echo it heard, would be overwhelmed. It would dive into the wrong building, strike a harmless wall, or simply fail to acquire a target at all. The weapon that had conquered the mountain was deafened by the city. Dr. Finch and his team, now elevated from backroom eccentrics to military VIPs, were thrown back into the crucible of innovation. They needed to make the shell not just hear, but discern. They needed to teach it how to listen to a symphony of echoes and pick out the single correct note. The solution they devised was another leap of genius, an upgrade so profound it felt like a generational jump in technology. They called it acoustic triangulation. Instead of a single beacon painting the target, the forward observers would now deploy 2 or ideally 3 small synchronized beacons in a wide pattern around the objective. Each beacon emitted the same coded melody, but from a different angle. The new shell, the T-14 Scalpel, was fitted with a vastly more complex processor. It was no longer listening for a single echo. Its mission was to acquire the signals from all the beacons and perform a near-instantaneous triangulation calculation. It would ignore any single echo, no matter how strong, and instead compute the precise point in 3-dimensional space where the melodies from all the beacons converged. This meant it could not only pinpoint a target on a map, but it could identify a specific window on a specific floor of a specific building. It could distinguish a rooftop from the street below, a cellar from the courtyard above. The shell no longer just heard its target. It could now visualize it in sonic space. The first operational test of the Scalpel came during the battle for the ancient town of Saint-Lô, a place that had become a fortress for a fanatical SS Panzergrenadier unit. An American rifle company was completely stalled, pinned down by 2 seemingly untouchable positions: a Panther tank concealed inside the thick stone walls of a medieval barn, and a machine gun nest perched in the town's church bell tower, which commanded a 360-degree field of fire. The American commander, a captain named Reyes, was in an impossible position. His orders were to take the town, but a conventional barrage would mean destroying the historic church and killing the dozens of civilians he knew were sheltering in its crypt. That night, an echo team arrived. 2 two-man scout units carrying the new, smaller beacons slipped into the rubble-strewn darkness. One team set up in a ruined bakery, the other in a blown-out storefront, creating a crossfire of sound that bracketed the town square. Their first target was the barn. Reyes watched through his binoculars as the scouts painted the barn from 2 different angles. The call went back to the artillery. Once again, a single gun fired. The shell arced high over the shattered town. As it descended, it began its silent conversation with the beacons. It ignored the echoes from the town hall, the houses, the streets. It was listening for the point where 2 melodies became one. The shell didn't strike the barn's slate roof. Instead, guided by the pinpoint triangulation, it adjusted its trajectory and punched straight through it, its fuse set to detonate a fraction of a second after impact. The explosion was contained, muffled. From the outside, it looked like nothing. But inside the barn, the Panther tank was a mangled, burning wreck, its crew killed instantly by the internal blast and shrapnel. The second target was the true test. The scouts re-aimed their beacons this time, painting the narrow arched opening of the church bell tower. This was a shot that defied belief, a target no bigger than a doorway suspended 100 feet in the air. Reyes held his breath. He had given the order, but he prayed he hadn't just doomed the civilians below. Another shell whistled overhead. It descended, corrected, and struck with surgical precision. The top of the bell tower vanished in a cloud of stone dust and twisted metal. The heavy bronze bell, its support shattered, plunged silently into the rubble below. The machine gun was gone. The main body of the church, including the crypt, was completely untouched. The next morning, the GIs of Reyes's company walked into the town square against only sporadic and disorganized resistance. The psychological linchpins of the German defense had been surgically removed. The enemy, who had believed themselves safe in their stone fortress, had been proven terrifyingly vulnerable. This was a new kind of war. It was not about annihilation anymore. It was about decapitation. The Scalpel gave American commanders an option that had never existed before: the ability to destroy the enemy without destroying the world around them. It saved the lives of countless soldiers who would have been forced to storm those strongpoints, and it saved the lives of countless civilians who would have been caught in the crossfire of a conventional bombardment. Project Echo had adapted, and in doing so it had proven itself to be more than just a clever weapon. It was an instrument of precision and power that offered a sliver of humanity in the midst of total war. The surgical precision witnessed in the ruins of Saint-Lô was not an isolated incident. It was the new, terrifying standard. The T-14 scalpel was no longer an experimental weapon deployed in secret. It was now the tip of the spear. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and across the Rhine into the heart of Germany, Project Echo's children became the decisive factor in countless battles. The ability to reach out and touch any target, no matter how well hidden or fortified, fundamentally broke the German army's defensive doctrine and accelerated the end of the war in Europe. What had begun as a desperate gamble in a California laboratory had morphed into an industrial behemoth, a secret empire of factories and assembly lines, running parallel to the public war effort. By VE Day, the United States had produced over 2 million hunter and scalpel rounds. The cost had ballooned to an astronomical figure exceeding $2 billion, a sum comparable to the early stages of the Manhattan Project. This was not a cottage industry. It was a river of steel and electronics that flowed from dozens of specialized component manufacturers to secured assembly plants, where workers sworn to secrecy pieced together the intricate guidance systems without ever knowing their true purpose. They were told they were building advanced radio fuses or navigation aids, a plausible lie that masked a reality far more revolutionary. The industrial might of America had not just been harnessed to build more tanks and planes, but to mass-produce miracles. The impact of this new capability was not lost on the men who led the Allied armies. In a now declassified letter written to General Leslie Groves in late 1944, General George S. Patton, a man who understood the brutal poetry of violence better than anyone, abandoned his usual gruffness for a tone of sheer awe. "You gentlemen in the labs have changed the very nature of my oldest and dearest friend, the artillery," he wrote. "For my entire career I have used cannons to kill areas. We saturate, we plaster, we annihilate, and we pray. Today, for the first time, my gunners killed a specific tank hiding behind a specific farmhouse from 7 miles away with 2 rounds. They are not firing shells, they are firing thunderbolts. You have given my artillerymen the eyes of God and the wrath of an avenging angel. The Hun has no answer for this because it is not warfare as he understands it. It is sorcery." Patton's final point was the most crucial. The ultimate success of Project Echo lay not just in its technology, but in its secrecy, which was maintained to the very end. The Germans, for all their engineering prowess, never figured it out. It was not a failure of intelligence, but a failure of imagination. They did capture several dud hunter rounds during the Battle of the Bulge. Their top ordnance experts at the Heereswaffenamt meticulously disassembled the captured nose cones. They found the crystal receivers, the vacuum tubes, the tiny fin actuators, and they came to a logical, methodical, and completely wrong conclusion. The final German analysis report identified the device as a highly advanced but ultimately conventional proximity fuse, perhaps one that used a radio or acoustic trigger to detonate the shell in the air above infantry formations. They saw the components, but they could not comprehend the philosophy behind them. The idea that a crude, disposable artillery shell could contain a guidance system, that it could listen, think, and steer itself, was so far beyond their conceptual horizon that it was never seriously considered. The German technological path was one of brute force and immense power, gigantic tanks like the Tiger II, the world's first jet fighters, and the V-2 ballistic missile. They were looking for bigger hammers. They never conceived that the Americans had invented a sentient scalpel. Their own technological dogma blinded them to the possibility of a weapon that derived its power not from a larger warhead, but from a sliver of intelligence. This ultimately is the eternal legacy of Project Echo. It did more than just help win a war. It fired the starting pistol on an entirely new age of military technology. The T-13 Hunter and T-14 Scalpel were the ancestors, the direct lineal patriarchs of every smart weapon that would define the modern battlefield. The ghost in that machine, the simple revolutionary idea that a munition could carry its own senses and make its own decisions, became the fundamental DNA for the decades of innovation that followed. The laser-guided bombs that found their targets with pinpoint accuracy in Vietnam, the fire-and-forget anti-tank missiles like the Javelin that allow a single soldier to defeat a main battle tank, the GPS-guided, JDAMs that can be dropped from 30,000 feet to strike a specific window. All of them are the direct descendants of Dr. Finch's acoustic shell. Project Echo transformed the very definition of a weapon. Before a weapon was a tool, a dumb object whose effectiveness was entirely dependent on the skill of the human operator. After Project Echo, the weapon itself could become part of the warrior. It embedded a fraction of the soldier's senses and intelligence into the projectile, allowing it to complete the mission on its own in the final critical seconds. It was a new covenant between man and machine on the battlefield. It was the birth of precision warfare, the beginning of the end for the age of indiscriminate bombardment. The silent coded melody sent out by an OSS scout in the dead of an Italian night was the first note in a symphony of technological change that is still being played today. Those shells did not just destroy their targets, they shattered the old paradigms of war forever, and their echoes continue to shape the world we live in. The story of Project Echo in the end returns to that single impossible moment in the frozen Apennine Valley. It returns to Lieutenant Miller and the men of Able Company who stared in disbelief as a lone artillery shell defied the laws of God and physics to deliver them from certain death. What they witnessed was not a miracle. It was the violent, brilliant culmination of a hidden war, a war fought not with bayonets and bullets but with slide rules, oscilloscopes, and the audacious power of human ingenuity. It was the moment a secret whispered in the soundproofed labs of California was finally screamed across a battlefield in a language of precise, targeted destruction. That single shell and the millions that followed represented more than just a new piece of hardware. It was the dawn of a new philosophy of warfare. For millennia, the cannon had been the ultimate instrument of brute force. Its power was measured in the sheer indiscriminate violence it could unleash upon a landscape. It spoke in a language of craters and concussions, of saturation and annihilation. Project Echo taught it a new language. It unchained the shell from the rigid laws of ballistics and gave it a sliver of its creator's consciousness. It gave it ears to hear, a brain to think, and fins to guide. The revolution was not in the size of the explosion, but in its address. For the first time in history, firepower could be delivered not just to a grid square on a map, but to a specific window, a specific gun emplacement, a specific enemy. The king of battle, once a blind berserker, had become a master assassin. This transformation carried with it a profound, if paradoxical, moral weight. In a conflict defined by its industrial scale of slaughter, the hunter and scalpel rounds offered a new, more discerning form of lethality. By eliminating the need to level entire city blocks to destroy a single machine gun nest, they saved the lives of countless innocent civilians caught in the crossfire of liberation. By surgically removing the linchpins of an enemy's defense, they saved the lives of thousands of Allied soldiers who would have otherwise been ordered into suicidal frontal assaults against untouchable positions. It was a weapon forged for killing that through its very precision became an instrument of preservation, proving that the most effective path to victory is not always the most destructive. The legacy of that achievement is written in the code of every smart weapon that defines the modern age. The ghost in that first acoustic shell, the simple radical idea of sentient steel, now inhabits the guidance systems of cruise missiles, drones, and hypersonic weapons. But beyond the technology, the enduring legacy of Project Echo is a testament to what is possible when human intellect is focused in absolute secrecy on a problem deemed impossible. It proved that the most formidable fortress can be defeated not by a bigger cannon, but by a better idea. The roar of conventional artillery had defined warfare for centuries, but in the end, it was a silent ultrasonic melody and the intelligent whisper of a single listening shell that truly changed the world.